First of all, I want to thank everyone for tuning in to the Bvlos Sync. We'll be talking a lot about regulation, Bvlos, how to enable that. And throughout, if you ever have any questions about anything, feel free to drop them into the chat. We will have a live Q&A session at the end. We should have about 15, 20 minutes for that. So drop that in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get that answered at the end. But I'd like to go ahead and kick this off. I'm going to give Alice and Kyle a minute here to introduce themselves and tell you a little about what they do, who they're with, and what their company does. So Kyle, you want to go ahead and kick us off with a minute intro?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adam. So some familiar names on here that we've been working with for a while on the webinar, so it's good to see. And obviously, USI has been a close partner of Census for many years now, delivering all of our commercial training to everyone pursuing a Bvlos effort alongside their program. So been a longstanding partner of ours. This is the first webinar we've done with them as a part of this Sync series. So hopefully there's some new content delivered throughout this. I know Alice provided some slides, but some quick introductions for those that don't know me. I'm Kyle Miller. I'm our director of sales. I've been with the company for almost 7 years now. By the end of this year, it'll be about 7 years. So kind of flies. I definitely had more hair when I started, but it's been a very, very fun seven years, and excited to be back in the office. We've been traveling quite a bit over the last few weeks. So there should be some good content coming to you guys from this presentation and the subsequent webinars following.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. Good morning or good afternoon, I guess, to everyone. I'm calling in from Washington, D.C. area, and thank you to Kyle and to Adam for including USI on this great webinar. Excited to be part of the series since this has been a fantastic partner. I echo everything that Kyle just said and shared with us. The whole team over there has been fantastic to work with. USI does a lot of training. I am new to USI. I'm about 5 months in, just under, but not new to the industry. I've been in the industry for about 8 years. I've covered 3 kind of key sectors of it. I would say really like the medical delivery space was my early into the industry for about 4.5 years. And then I was recently with Airspace Link and did a lot with airspace authorizations, LANC integration, working with state and local governments to figure out permitting and zoning, and really how they're going to monitor and manage everything in the lower airspace in partnership with the FAA. And now I'm part of USI's team, and we specialize in training, really pilot training, but walking everything to advanced industry standards, making sure that everything has a certification track, more than your 107 license by far. But we take great care in making sure that everything is aligned with industry standards, and back to best practices, and really just to make sure that you have an excellent offering and training. And we have several tracks we'll talk about later in the program.
Muted, Adam.
Yeah, Adam.
Yep, thank you for that. Sorry. Thank you for the intros. One final thing, this webinar will be recorded, so at the end, if you feel like you missed anything, you want to watch it back or share this information, we will be uploading it to YouTube and sharing the link that way. You also might get an email with the link as well, so keep an eye out for that. But Kyle, if you want to go ahead and kick us off here and take us away.
Yeah, sure. So there's a handful of these regulations as a part of Part 107 that really start to unlock the value for drone technology when waived. So the one that Census talks a lot about, and frankly the industry does too, would probably be 107.31, which governs beyond visual line of sight operations and the waiver of the regulation to maintain visual line of sight of the aircraft as the RPIC. But there's some other ones on here that we'll talk about as well. 107.33 talks about visual observers and the need for them based on different types of ConOps, and whether you're flying long linear distances or remote operations out of a dock. I know there's some names on here that's a big part of their program. So there's been a lot of advancement across every letter and number on here over the last several years. Really, the last 1.5 to 2 years has been an explosion of not only the quantity of regulations waived, but really the quality too. So, we've been knocking on the door for Bvlos operations since 2017, but you look at some of the approvals even backdating to 2020, 2021 versus now, and a lot of these approvals are for the same organizations. They're just taking advantage of, more data provided to the agency and getting additional language approved alongside the Bvlos language. So we'll talk about a few of these, but a lot of these are going to be familiar. Some of them don't necessarily apply to Census specifically, but they definitely apply to getting the most out of your UAS technology being deployed daily across the country, so, and the world for that matter. So I was just out last week at the Skydio event, so they talked a lot about the drone as a first responder waiver, kind of getting some unique approvals in that space. The shielded operations waiver is kind of consistent across a few different means and methods of unlocking the BVLOS value chain. What that means for us and a lot of others is essentially there's a limited altitude that the aircraft can fly at above or adjacent to infrastructure, terrain, vegetation, whatever it might be. That altitude is capped to better mitigate air risk. So the general's principle being that GA is not going to be, in this instance, 100 feet above obstacles. So anything's possible, but the overall risk profile is significantly reduced when talking about a reduction in the UA's altitude. The nationwide BVLOS waiver I'll talk on next since it's highlighted here. That is essentially fancy language for performance-based approvals. So we get a lot of questions, whether it be from a utility or a state government that wants the entire service territory covered. They want all the utility lines, all the roadways, if it's a DOT, they want all that stuff covered. Well, that's easy. We don't actually have to name all the roads and all the upload all KMLs for utility right-of-ways or roadway infrastructure. What we're simply doing is providing a set of performance-based criteria that if the operation is conducted in accordance with, then you can kind of go forth and prosper after site survey and area analysis are done. So essentially removing all geographic language associated with the waiver to permit operations more flexibly than ever before. So we also have geo-constrained waivers on here. So I think that kind of lends itself nicely. A lot of folks think that because these performance-based requests are kind of the buzzword is blanket waiver, since a lot of those are getting approved and also very flexible now. A lot of folks think that the geographically constrained waiver has kind of gone the way of the wayside. Kind of. It's not entirely true. It's not 100% going to be that case all the time. I think back a good example that I always go back and cite is we were working with a company in North Dakota that was flying a 33-mile river system weekly for the next several years as part of a construction project. So I won't name the company, but he knows I use it on every presentation and webinar. That is a home run example of when you only have to dial in and kind of address the risks present in that 33-mile river system, you can get more lenient, more flexible, more creative about mitigating those risks over that specific area. So some of those, some language in a waiver like that might actually be more flexible than even the today's performance-based waivers, which has become incredibly conducive to scalable operations. The gap between geographically constrained and non-geographically constrained has absolutely narrowed over the years, but there's still some instances where that extra effort to analyze risk over specific areas is definitely worth it. If it was 3,300 miles, that might not be the case, but 33 miles in that scenario, perfect example of where a geographically constrained waiver still has value. So the other two I'll hit on here, very relevant to us, is the operations over people and operations over moving vehicles waivers. Census does not integrate a ASTM certified parachute. That would ultimately cut into our allowable payload. So what we've done is actually leverage a combination of factors to get some of this language approved so that our right-of-way customers or anybody doing these operations don't have to cease an operation and land or turn around at the point of a road crossing because the flight would go over it. Now, citing minimal risk exposure, we're only going to be over the road a certain period of time, being a fixed wing flying between 40 and 45 miles an hour, our overall exposure to that roadway is pretty limited. So we're definitely using that as a means to get some of this language approved. The other thing that we're doing is citing aircraft reliability. What is our overall hours without incident? General language that a lot of you folks are probably familiar with, but we're applying that language to our overall safety case as well. There's a couple of other metrics that we use to cite, but essentially we're operating for linear asset owners and roadways and things like that. I haven't yet found too many areas where you can't cross that road, regardless of lanes and regardless of cars per minute. That is no longer a factor. So that safety case, just like any other safety case, is always evolving. And today's safety case won't be tomorrow's, but the theme of growth and pushing towards mass market usability, adoption, and scalability, that growth is always occurring regardless of the language. So a little bit on the waiver process. A question we get a lot is how long does it take? It's starting to become more industry known, the overall process, especially as the adoption curve continues to mature. But essentially, you got to start with your CONOP. What are you trying to achieve? And then what you're trying to achieve lends itself to where are you trying to achieve it? And then that presents the risks associated with the operation. So looking at both air risks and ground risks. What is your chance of overflight of people or moving vehicles, risks to people on the ground? Are you trying to do this in an urban setting or a rural setting? Those are general questions that present themselves after you start with your CONOP. And outlining all of your mitigations to that air risk and to that ground risk component starts to develop the safety case naturally. So, what aircraft are you flying? I guess probably more so starting with what organization are you with? What are you trying to do? What aircraft are you flying? And what risks are present? Getting in front of that overall mission profile starts to identify and mitigate all the risks associated with performing those flights. Are you flying in controlled airspace or in uncontrolled airspace? Are you going to be flying at 400 feet lower or above 400 feet? So kind of getting into 107.51 Bravo, are you going to be requesting operations greater than 400 feet? That presents itself an entirely new set of challenges that are all overcomable, but things to consider when drafting up some of these complex ops requests. One thing that we always talk about, and we'll get into it in a later slide, is that filling out the waiver safety explanation guidelines. Sometimes those guidelines actually change, and staying up to date with WSEG questions are oftentimes very critical in actually getting a seamless approval process, kind of behind you and operations underway. So all that stuff gets packaged up into a waiver submission and entered into your drone zone account. So, yep, common mistakes right there. So the WSEG response is not directly answering them. Is something that we see sometimes, especially if Census as a provider of that service, since 2017, has occasionally had to go in and help someone that might have failed the first time. Because frankly, the guidance after a denial is not very comprehensive. You kind of get the same canned language about why your waiver got denied. You don't really know why, other than some canned language. So the WSEG responses are something that usually gets people, kind of strung up. And then also it's just insufficient risks or insufficient mitigations to risks rather. So, if you have things like access to some types of detect and avoid measures, you look at something like Ohio, they have a 200 square mile networked radar solution. Out there in North Dakota, same thing. These are tools and resources that are available sometimes at the state level or through other test site programs. That's just an example. Those test sites are an example of how technology can scale. But in the real world, there's other access to risk mitigators, some things like ADS-B. For in controlled airspace, it's a great tool to cite as a overall mitigator to air risk. The other one that we always talk about is not giving enough information. So oftentimes there's an assumption that when you're developing a safety case that you're not going to step in the pothole and break your leg. So you don't bother putting that in your safety case. But really that is a downfall to some applications that you're assuming common sense when a safety case has to be spelled out exactly. So that's something, insufficient information is oftentimes, you have all the information, but you didn't put it in your application. That's something that we see sometimes that, is an easy fix, but something that gets overlooked in the process.
Thanks, Kyle. Continuing on the same with the CONOPS, as far as writing a CONOPS, Kyle just gave some great tips and talked to the great mistakes or some mistakes that are common. And I think all those, it was great information. Another kind of extension of that is really making sure that you're defining your safety case or your risk profile is really how you're defining it. And then you get into your safety case for how you're going to mitigate air and ground risk. So those are the two components of a safety case. It's really air risk and ground risk. And with USI, we usually take an approach at looking at SORA, the specific area or specific operations risk assessment out of the EU for safety case development within aircraft or within UAS and unmanned aircraft systems. But the risk profile image on the slide is intended to kind of look at a couple different ways people operate. So different operators, different operations, you have to understand what your organization is comfortable with and what your operations are. Are they beyond visual line of sight, or are you trying to go into beyond visual line of sight, or are you just in a line of sight operation? But there's a lot of different risk within that space. So you still are going to have air risk, you're still going to have ground risk, and you have to define it, and then you have to say within your ConOps how you're going to mitigate it. And so if we look at kind of this stage 1 scenario, you might have a vertical infrastructure operation, 10 pounds, just a small aircraft doing a visual line of sight operations, which might seem pretty low risk, but you still have the line of sight that you have to manage, and you have to explain to the FAA how you're going to manage that line of sight operation. Do you have a visual observer, or is it just the pilot in command that's going to manage it? What's the level of operations? What's the altitude? All those different things are great, but then getting into kind of a scalable model for managing your organization, your tech, and your personnel is the other component to it. So when you break down how you're managing risk, it should be organized into 3 categories. It's really, how does your organization manage risk? Like, what's your risk profile? Defining that a little bit more for air and ground, how you're going about looking at the types of risks that are there. Like, what's the technology that you're using to assess it? It can be a visual observer, it can be radars, it could be a couple different things to look at air risk. And with ground risk, it's sometimes, going to be your population density. We talked about crossing roads. So is there any traffic that you're trying to look at? Defining all that and providing as much information as possible. If we go back to those 3 categories, organization, personnel, and tech, your technology is going to be your aircraft. It's going to be some of that tech that we just talked about to maybe look at or analyze air and ground risk. But when we get into organization, it's kind of your safety culture, your process, like how are you mitigating it? And then when you get into personnel, it's how is your team trained? How is your talent trained to handle that? And what are the processes that you have in place as far as standard operating procedures, emergency response procedures, and all of that. So stage 1 is a very low risk operation. Stage 2 is getting into a higher risk operation. Regardless of how you go about it with your ConOps, it's just defining the spaces and making sure you have your area of operations defined, which we'll get into in a little bit, but then also like how you're managing risk and your organization, your personnel, and your training that's there to support all of that information. So when we get into area of operations, Kyle alluded to, it could be location specific, or you could have a whole nationwide waiver. It depends on your ability to get that, but there's a lot of ways to look at how you're going about getting that. And this is the regulatory framework that exists for emerging tech today. So we've got quite a bit on the screen, but you've got kind of the general Part 91, general aviation, that oversees quite a bit. And it's kind of its own box, if you will. It is literally on the screen, but then in general, there are some waivers that come out of Part 91 for specific things, but most of the operations are leaning towards Part 107. We have something new coming with Part 108, which I'll explain in a minute. And then there is some operations that are happening under 135 and 137 for package delivery or for agricultural operations. Some more complex things, but still line of sight or beyond visual line of sight in that extent. But for everything 107, that's where Kyle kind of went into a lot of the different waiver certificates for waiver that would come off of Part 107. And it's intended to be for line of sight operations, but clearly you can get to a beyond visual line of sight waiver if you have a good ConOps, and if you have a good area of operations, and if you have your everything together, all your documentation together to get yourself that award that certificate. These Part 107, these are the majority of operations today. So this is a framework that's really specific to the individual. So there is a remote pilot in command that does take ownership and liability for these operations, and that's been a little bit challenging for some larger organizations that are scaling and looking to add a lot of pilots to their team, have a lot of operations running at the same time, and truly like get into a scaled environment for growing their operations. And some teams have upwards of 200, sometimes 250 or more pilots, and that's there's a lot that 107 does not cater to in that space, which is where 108 will get into that more at the organizational level. But there's been hundreds of approved waivers, actually thousands of approved waivers, I think, since 2020 under the space. There's all sorts of things happening. Kyle alluded to some of the bridge inspections, definitely some infrastructure inspections outside of bridges. You have telecommunications, you have power lines, gas mitigation or understanding if there are any gas leaks, but also delivery, healthcare. Some people have been pretty forward on explaining kind of where they're doing some of that. So a lot of that hits the news. But then there's a huge amount of surveying and visual imagery, photogrammetry, all sorts of things that are going on in the GIS space with drones, and then drone-in-a-box solutions, of course, for perimeter security, surveillance, and also inspections as well. So there's a lot in 107 that's happening today, but this is the existing framework, and it's a little bit limiting, which is why everyone's getting their certificates of waiver or actually or applying for that. So Part 108 is intended, it's a notice for proposed rulemaking, an NPRM that will, it's supposed to be released this year by end of year, hopefully around November timeframe if we're lucky, but potentially as late as New Year's Eve. The FAA has committed to getting this waiver out this year, getting the NPRM out this year. And the intention of this rule is to enable the organization, empower the organization to have a different structure of liability, and also to enable beyond visual line of sight operations with a framework and really a qualification framework for how to do that. And so you will still see waivers probably continue on, but this is intended to replace some of the process for getting waivers for people that have tried to do this for years, and they might be bounded by location-specific ops or aircraft-specific ops, or maybe a particular pilot that has to run the operations. So the framework should enable the industry to scale. We waited about 10 years for it. The notice for proposed rulemaking does usually get a 1-year comment period. Might be a little bit longer, it depends. But we would look to see this probably taking effect in late 2025 at the earliest, but more than likely 2026. But the notice for proposed rulemaking will be out for people to review. And that's something that's very exciting for the industry. It will enable a lot more in this space, and happy to answer any questions about that if you guys have any more. For 135 and 137, oh, sorry, just go back real quick. The key differences here, I think, are just understanding that if you're in a delivery space or you're trying to move cargo or goods, 135 still has a lot of application here, particularly if you're doing hazmat or if you have air carrier needs for services to get paid for services. It's a very different framework for how regulations will allow organizations to get paid for the work that they do there. And for 137, whole level of complexity there with dispensing or spraying substances from aircraft. So there is those two rule sets will probably stay true to those types of use cases. Even though 108 might see some of that, they're really designed to carry those use cases. And just to touch on Part 146, because some people may not know or be familiar with this, but out of the Dallas Key site this year, we have seen what will become a UTM qualification framework emerge. And so we've had UTM companies, Wing and Zipline, and then also ANRA and the teams down there that are doing some UTM work. They've had approvals on their UTM services. So the UTM qualification for the safety case needs and for the criteria that will exist and require what someone needs to use for a UTM will be living under the Part 146 expansion. Also, in a notice for proposed rulemaking that will come out next year. Yes, Kyle. Oh, you're on mute.
All right. You mentioned that there's likely still going to be a need for waivers in the future, which, obviously Census as a provider of those, that you would think that that's something that we're like, oh no, we wish waivers could continue forever. It's actually not something that we want. We would prefer operations to be, as easily accessible as possible so that we ultimately sell more equipment. So we echo the same. We think there's going to be a need for waivers in the future, but I wanted to get you a quick question on what you foresee as the possible, or what Part 108 will cover under rule.
I do think that Part 108 will almost eliminate the need for location-specific waivers and for aircraft-specific waivers. So my understanding of the rules is there's a planned 2 different components, an airworthiness component and an operational component for the proposed rule. What that means is if an aircraft can meet these certain standards and maintain airworthiness, it should be able to operate in a beyond visual line of sight capacity. That will still be defined by the operator and what the operator is capable of doing by probably a level of permits or whatever they're planning on doing. At one time it was 4 levels of permits, which would enable you to do over people or not over people, things like that. So I think that what we'll see is a drop in waivers for location-specific operations and aircraft-specific operations. But I do think that you'll have some people that will still work to operate what they have as a blanket, and airspace waiver that you mentioned in the beginning, because I don't know that you necessarily are going to have every area in the country with population still be something that people can fly in a Part 108 capacity. So I do think there'll still be waivers. I don't know how they're going to work under Part 108. I'm curious to see how that works. But I can't imagine that it's going to cover every single thing that people want to do and will be able to do, just like we thought 107 was covered for a while. But then as the 10-year period started to go on, everyone still needed loopholes to get around certain things. So I think we'll still see that in 108.
Yep. Gotcha. Right. And not to derail too much and screw the timeline up here, but you look at like Canada, right? 400 feet or less, sparsely populated areas, Class G airspace, no more than 4 miles from the RPIC. Good under general rulemaking. There's some sentiment that that'll be kind of similar to Part 108 flexibilities, but generally speaking, we don't have a single customer that's okay with buying a Centero 5 and only operating to that capacity. So we're still going to have the need to get our 50-mile point-to-point waivers and controlled or uncontrolled airspace and higher altitude. So unfortunately, that's a regulatory thing that we'll have to continue to keep providing to continue to keep enable and empower customers of our system. So thank you for that feedback, and I'll shut up now.
Oh, no, I think it's great questions. A couple things that I think are important to point out when you're operating under certificate of waiver. So this is where USI can help with folks, but ultimately it's really just an awareness. So it's understanding that it may be clear to everybody, but understanding that your operations manual is, your Bible, it's the guide, and it is a requirement to maintain that based on whatever ConOps you write. So making sure it's cross-referenced to the aircraft, to the team, to how you're going to operate, how you're going to mitigate risk in ground and airspace capacities, but also for your safety culture. All of that's very important. And having SOPs, ERPs that live under that manual is going to be a big component of how you have to maintain that in order to operate in compliance under a waiver. There's also, you're required to track pilot proficiency, and you're required to record and track maintenance. So maintenance functionality, not necessarily every single to the component level, but it does say that in its components, it's just that it's a little bit gray in that space. But being able to do this, I would say it's not SOP for everyone right now. So if you're going to enter into operating under certificate of waiver, having the ability to do this, making sure that your documentation is as good as it needs to be, and making sure that you have the ability to track maintenance and the proper training that you should have for your pilot teams. I mean, USI is here to enable beyond visual line of sight. We partner with Census because we think that they've done a fantastic job. They're probably doing the most beyond visual line of sight waivers and achieving the most scalability in the Bvlos space. But they're doing it because they're compliant and they have a great aircraft, but they still have requirements, and we have to train to those requirements. So when we jump into a little bit of where drones are being used in the industry today, I think this is an interesting graphic. This is not necessarily line of sight or beyond visual line of sight. This is intended to be at large, not one specific area or another. I do think that, this is something that's third party published. It was published, I think, just last week. So it's a fairly new report, but by Drone Industry Insights. And so you're welcome to, I think we'll share the slides, but the sources on the bottom, you're welcome to read the report. It is a report they have to purchase to get these graphs. But the mapping and surveying space has just grown tremendously over the last couple of years, as well as the inspection. So I think this is where our industry is just seeing tremendous scalability and tremendous growth, particularly with beyond visual line of sight operations, because they might have long linear, or they might just have the ability to really show the improvement in work safety, quality, how aircraft can help save time and even reduce costs compared to helicopters or whatever other aircraft they were using to operate for those types of mitigations or damage control or just general inspections. So a lot of great, interesting stuff here. Happy to talk to it in general, but it's a nice snapshot of where drones are being used and how they're being, where the benefits are. And I know we want to leave some time for questions, so I'll probably keep this short, but we do have a couple different industry use cases. These are all linked to great stories if you want to look at these later on your time, on your own time. And the Census video, it's down there as well, great beyond visual line of sight video. But I also just came back from the Skydio conference, and I thought there were some interesting things that were happening there. So a couple things that were shared that I just thought were great use cases, and Kyle, I'll invite you to kind of join in on any of this. But I heard obviously about Alaska DOT using drones to mitigate avalanche and really expedite FEMA response. So I thought that was just, being able to go out there, understand, and kind of take a visual snapshot every day if they needed to, or wherever it might be. I think they're maintaining avalanche on their own kind of day-to-day record. But then also, if there is a need for a FEMA response, typically that's a week, sometimes a couple of weeks, usually 2 to 3 weeks actually, on turnaround time for release of funds. And if you have a drone, you can actually go fly the area of need in a day or two and usually expedite that process of funds by a dramatic amount by having the images available immediately through different technology. So I thought that was interesting. They also shared a couple of stories about in West Virginia, a litigation case that if they had implemented maybe the use of drones in a highway roadway upgrade, they might have saved about 6 months of time and $50 million in litigation, because the highway in this bridge they were trying to put in ended up being about 13 inches off when they tried to align it, and they didn't have a lot of proper aerial imaging to kind of look at that. So little, I guess, case for where drones aren't being used and how they could improve in construction, and then where drones are being used and how they've helped with FEMA response. Kyle, did you hear anything good coming off of that?
Yeah, so I think the thing that stood out to me was on the DFR side. So I'm very familiar with like the bridge inspection programs and how the dock systems are being used at substations, and kind of that work for remote ops and unlocking that, which I guess is also still DFR, but doing remote ops. But seeing some of those videos played where they launch an aircraft from a rooftop or otherwise, and it's the first on scene by several minutes, if not more. And gets all the first responders' eyes on the situation and information about the situation, before they enter that chaos, which is usually a call for service, is somewhat chaotic, or hopefully not. But I think the thing that stood out to me as well is listening to the sergeant over NYPD's program talk about, I don't know if you guys can guess in your head right now, but how many 911 calls the NYPD gets per day. You just think of a number, guess 3, 2, 1, 35,000. 35,000 calls for service a day. They have about 20,000 uniformed folks working for NYPD. So, you can divide and conquer somewhat, but really what the DFR stuff's doing, whether it's Skydio or others, drones technology in general, is serving as a force multiplier for some of the, all the way up from the biggest agencies all the way down to county government. So some of the things that we'll talk about over this next couple of use cases, I think we've talked about this in previous ones, but this is not a 2,000-mile Bvlos project, but it's something that would have taken months prior. Something we did last year, we flew shielded. We were connected the whole time through our LTE for primary command and control. I don't know if it was 15 or 16 miles or something like that, down a waterway for blue-green algae assessment, up into a canal alongside Lake Okeechobee in Florida. Never been to Lake Okeechobee in Florida. I wouldn't say you're missing a ton, but it's a pretty cool spectacle. It's only like 9 feet deep across the whole lake, even though it looks like the ocean. But that would have traditionally taken upwards of weeks, if not months, without contracting someone like Civil Air Patrol or otherwise to do those flights whenever they had time. So now they have a bit of an on-demand capability to go assess the blue-green algae across the waterways. So I think the next one is another one to talk about. I'm actually also going to go off script. This is ironic because Flagler's doing the same thing tomorrow. But flying, Flagler County is just up north of Volusia County. I believe the whole beach, the whole coastal section of Flagler County is about 18 miles. So they want access to fly that coastline before or after each storm so they can better assess sand conditions and dune conditions and otherwise. As sand gets pulled out into the Atlantic from these weather systems, they're getting funding to replace the sand on the beaches and kind of restore those beaches to exactly what makes Florida so tourist friendly. It's one of our biggest industries here. So restoring these beaches and communities back to what draws people to the state of Florida is of the utmost importance to the state of Florida and our governor. But you can only replace the sand that left, and if you don't know how much sand left, it's tough to do that. So they're actually going out and flying the beach again tomorrow. And again, that's another thing that would have taken weeks, if not months. I believe some of the beaches down in Southwest Florida after Hurricane Ian got their sand reports about a year and a half after Hurricane Ian, which is kind of crazy, but that's the truth. So I thought that was a pretty staggering number, whereas they can fly the beach, get the access to the information, they could do something about it, submit for funding more promptly. Speaking of hurricanes, this is not going to be a slide, but Census has 2 teams out flying roadway assessments in the state of Florida right now. The target for us is a couple hundred miles. They started flying sometime over the weekend. They're already halfway done. So some of those operations being done under our existing waiver applications and approvals, and then some of them being done under special government interest emergency certificates of authorization, flying under SGI, getting some more liberties there. So this stuff is happening every day. It's literally happening now. As I say this, there's folks flying after a storm, flying Bvlos, providing value in that regard. So it's a very, very exciting time. There's probably been more traction and progress on this front, the scalable use of this technology in the last 12 months than in the previous 5 years, which is a very, very exciting thing for obviously in my seat and an analysis seat doing a lot of the enablement so people can actually go do this because the technology and the regulations are kind of finally in concert. Right now, the regs are supporting what the technology can do. And ironically, we're having to go back and say, okay, we're seeing system limitations in things like endurance. We always want to fly longer. We always want to fly in more terrain. We always want to fly in higher density altitudes. Now we're going back to the technology side and saying, let's get the aircraft to do more because the regulations are in a place to support that, which has been the first time of that in a while. We've had a Ferrari in a parking lot for kind of a few years now. And now we're seeing that kind of marriage of capability and permission and ultimately pushing into we need to go back and up our capability again, which is where you want to be as a technology provider.
Awesome. And thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Alice, for giving us your insight into the regulatory state and, kind of what the future looks like as well. If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat now. We will be moving into our live Q&A time. But kind of to start one off, I'll start one off with you, Alice. For census, when we write our waivers, the training that goes that the pilots get to fly our system is part of our waiver application, but it's not necessarily something that's part of or needed for like the Part 107. But if companies were wanting to get trained or get certified for these more complex ops, why is it so important to go with a certified training partner than just doing, something in-house?
Great question. Thank you for that. Ultimately, USI does offer a lot of different enhanced options after the 107 as a prerequisite. For any pilot operations is to have your Part 107 license. Probably everyone on the phone knows this. We do kind of refer to it as a learner's permit. You've got it. You haven't really gone out and really got your railroad experience yet. If you are flying aircraft, even if you are sophisticated, it's still good to be trained, right? I still get trained. I'm a volunteer EMT. I still get trained as often as I can in order to maintain different levels of sophistication if I need to. And there's a lot of different industries that offer those types of certification tracks. So what USI does is different. We offer really a stage 1, stage 2, or primary and advanced type of training. It's intended to be after you have gotten your 107. So the primary would be first, and then you would go into an advanced beyond visual line of sight track. And they are both certification programs. They are walked back to industry standards, ASTM and NIST in particular, and then we adhere to industry best practices in partnership with ICAO and several different traditional aviation organizations. And we really treat it like a flight school. So it's kind of like your 141 or Part 61, Part 141 flight school at traditional aviation levels. You have a self-knowledge base, but it's very robust. There's a lot of different things to entertain. I would love to go through the curriculums with anybody that's really interested, but the key is the flight school at the end and really applying all of the knowledge that you get through the program. They are meant to be taken while you're at work. It's a little bit cumbersome, but it's intended to get you as educated as you possibly can. And we do I just looked up the numbers because Kyle was asking me before the event kicked off. We did 2,500 primary trainings, stage 1 trainings thus far with industry. So it's definitely something that we see as people are finding value in it. They're seeing that there is a level of knowledge that is ahead of just getting aircraft training or maybe a basic scenario training. We do offer like flying in the wire environment, scenario specific trainings, but they're not a certification track. And the idea here is that a certification is supposed to really enable you to be either your own training institution and you can take that track, or really just be certified in the space that's at the highest level that it can be towards an aviation grade type program.
Thank you for that. And Kyle, I'll throw this next question over to you. And you could probably relate this kind of to our customer base, but when we were talking about, applying the mitigations, we talked a little about like the history of the aircraft, the prior performance of the aircraft, and you kind of touched on a little bit, but can you kind of explain or go into a little more detail, Kyle, on the like pilot's performance, in the more prior performance they have operating, how does that apply to like a crawl, walk, run scenario for waiver applications?
Yeah, I mean, all that gets baked into the safety case, right? So if you're an operating entity, name an example. Was just out the right before the Skydio thing. I was out with Pacific Gas and Electric. They had a kind of an internal conference where they invite all their pilots and some vendor partners and things like that, and go over their goals, their targets, what they've done so far, where they're going, and all that kind of stuff, where their direction and where they've been, where they want to go, type thing. And a group like that, right? They're flying. I think I typed it all up the other day, but 8,000 miles worth of UV and thermal, 400,000 distribution assets, and they're flying them in one way, shape, or form. Crewed rotorcraft, UAS, contracted, internal, all of that operational excellence really gets built into the safety case. And all of the standards that an organization puts on their internal pilots or contractors, training standards specifically, SMS, SOPs, all that stuff gets built into the safety case. And that's inherently going to open the skies for that group, maybe a little bit more than someone that's coming in a little bit more green. We see that all the time. But the backbone is also like we've been talking about and kind of harping on, is a strong set of identified risks and kind of quality risk mitigations. Those are going to always be the backbone. But that ancillary stuff like operational excellence and history of prior approvals and operations conducted under prior approvals also gets built in. So, as we've been pumping out these operations with our customers over the years, when we go and submit for them to now operate over, in California, for example, when Caltrans goes to operate and get approval to fly over the 405, it's a 12-lane highway. That's not something you roll out of bed and go do without planning and precedent and operational execution to fall back on when you're going for those types of green lights. So that's the kind of stuff that we take into account. That's what makes each waiver still different. A lot of people ask us, are these waivers copy and paste? Well, yeah, to some degree, yeah. A lot of language is the same. It's still a Centero 5. It's still a personnel qualification that we've mandated, for 6 years working with USI. All of that stuff is consistent, but the operating entity is different. The area of operations might be different. What they're requesting is different. High altitude, low altitude, shielded, 1,500 feet. Is it Part 91? Is it 107? Is it a COA? Is it a certificate of waiver? All that stuff is still very different. So there's still definitely a level of hands-on approach to how these types of things get initiated and ultimately over the line.
Thanks. And once again, if anyone's got any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But kind of tailoring what Kyle said on the end there, really being hands-on. One of my favorite things that USI does is, you still have to get stick time as part of your training. And Alice, kind of moving into the future, with automation, being at the forefront and, pilots more pre-planning on a computer and just flipping a switch and letting it do its thing. How important is it to maintain that stick time and that physical skill level?
Well, I would say we think it's very important, but I think ultimately the autonomy is where the industry wants to try and go. There's nothing that I think we want people to be autonomous. We just looked at, I know PG&E, Kyle just brought it up, but them getting an autonomy award just at Skydio, like the level of autonomy they've been able to achieve. We want to champion that, but I still think that if you are in the field and these are all new technology. I mean, this is all new technology. This is still a high risk operation because you've got something that's flying around that may or may not be 55 pounds under. If it's over, that's even more risky. But being able to take control and being able to operate it in an emergency situation, if need be, is where you have to be able to respond at your utmost best. And so I still feel like if you go out and were to not have stick training or not have hands-on training, it just would really, it would take the risk level so high in our organization that it would probably not be something that would be safe for anyone to operate in. So I feel like the hands-on training is just something that I don't think will ever go away entirely, but we do hope to enable autonomy and do hope to see aircraft systems that will be operating even in multiple vehicle to pilot ratio capacity. We've started to see some of that a little bit with some operators, but very few. But as that goes through, I mean, that's where the volume needs to go for this industry to commercialize and scale. It's just that you still need to be able, I think, to understand the safe aspect of it, and if you had to intervene or if you had to take over. And there's really some great core skills and core fundamentals that are taught during our course, but also in general with most people's flight trainings that are there for a reason. They're there for you to have control if you need it.
Awesome, thank you. It looks like we don't have any questions in the comments, so I'll go ahead and give you each some time for a closing statement. Alice, I don't know if you want to start off, then Kyle, if you want to finish us up, that'd be great.
Yeah, so Kyle had asked me before the break how many of the primary certifications. I had to go look up the numbers, so it's 2,500, and how many we think will actually shift into the advanced track or into an advanced type of training. How many people are actually going to need it? How many people are going to want it? How many people are going to embrace it? And so I actually had like a little side chat with the team before we were going into this, and I think we ended up agreeing on 30% because we do think that the adoption rate is going to take a little bit to take on, but I do think that that will grow. I think people, when I talk to people in my day-to-day life, most people are a little bit scared to go into beyond visual line of sight, and I think for the right reason. It's risk to your organization and there's liability, but I think it's really finding the right aircraft partner. It's finding the right, making sure the right use case is there for your team to grow and making sure you have all the things put in place. It's hard to build a drone program, whether you live under an aviation department or whether you live independently. There's a lot of ways to structure it, but ultimately there's a lot of risk that you take on for the organization. It costs money, and it requires time for a program manager or corporate governance to come in and put time into these things. I think once you get things in a really good position, you can learn from some of these industry leaders like PG&E and like some other folks that are even now starting to trend toward ISBAO compliance. It's a voluntary standard, but they're wanting to go to stage 1. They've openly talked about that with themselves and with their supplier partners. So I think that that's like, you've got this kind of wide range of people, wide range of space where operations are really going to start to jump with this new rule, this new framework, this new rule set that's essentially going to come with Part 108. And I think it's a really exciting time for us to be entering into the space. And I'm actually glad if we're saying 30% will kind of transition into this space, because it gives us time to focus on making sure it's quality over quantity and making sure people are trained well. And then really just to think, kind of see where all the drones are going to add a lot more application as far as value, benefit, and just continue to see those good stories. So thanks for listening to me. Thanks for letting me be a part of this. You guys are great. Census, we love everything that you're doing, and keep going. Keep doing it.
Thank you, Kyle. Any closing comments or thoughts?
Yeah, and Alice, you bring up a good point. We heard that a lot last week. Was a lot of these utilities are moving their corporate flight departments on the UAS side towards ISBAO compliance. I thought that was very interesting. And another utility was talking about their adopting bars. I was unfamiliar with it, but you guys probably aren't. I was unfamiliar with it, but but the moral of that story is whether it's ISBAO or whether it's bars, they're adopting these standards internally for both internal pilots and contract pilots. That inherently is going to up the level of personnel qualification required to operate in a kind of a simple setting or a complex setting. So and that lends itself into what I was actually going to say for my closing statement is I met with a gentleman earlier last week as well that brought up a really good point. I was asking him what their biggest challenges are in growing some programs that they work with, whether it's the state level or the federal level. And he said, well, we've been selling technology for years. What we haven't been selling is programs. And that's really where I think we've kind of started to pivot at Census. I think we've done the same thing over the years. We've sold technology. We haven't, and then we're like, oh, why aren't these programs scaling? Well, because we weren't selling a program alongside it. What we were doing was, or what we have been doing is starting to enable through partners like USI and through other types of partners that are doing things like fleet management and things like program support. We offer the regulatory thing in-house, but that is really what's going to push everyone forward, including ourselves, towards a steady state level of operations that people get value from every day. And people get value from that don't even know that a drone provided that value. Alice, your point about the roadway thing, that disruption to commuting is something that could have been mitigated with the use of this type of technology. So I think that's very intriguing to me, and kind of a reason why we do what we do here and why we continue to get excited to do it every day.
Well, thank you. And go ahead, Alice.
No, I just was saying, well said. I couldn't have said it better myself. So good job, Kyle.
Thanks.
Well, thank you everyone for joining today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Kyle or Alice on LinkedIn, as well as USI or Census Technologies, or check us out on the website. We'll be happy to answer any additional questions or share the presentation or help you along your regulatory path or training path. I appreciate you guys once again for tuning in. We'll hopefully have another one of these Bvlos syncs with USI in about 6 or 7 months, and we'll have some new regulatory updates, probably a lot more on Part 108. Maybe some new waivers that will be more commonplace. So we're looking to do this about every 6 months or so, and we hope that you join in the next one and you got some really good value from this one. But thank you for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day.